How is everyone this morning?
Wonderful, thank you.
Good. We told Carol that we wanted sun today, and so Carol must have some pretty good standing. But anyway, hopefully we'll have a sunny day, and so that's great. We made the front page of the local paper again this morning. A great picture with our Impunity Watch essay contest winner, and so that's really great. This morning we have a very, very exciting speaker, and to introduce this morning's speaker, we have the pleasure of having J.D. Steer from the Enough Project. And so J.D. will come up and tell us about this morning's speaker and maybe a few words about the Enough Project. And so I will turn it over to J.D. And just after the lecture today, of course, the first speaker this morning is Valerie at 9:15 for our yearly update and recent developments. So we'll see you at that time after we finish this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. A beautiful day in Chautauqua, indeed. I'm grateful to the Jackson Center and the Chautauqua Institute for hosting this inspired event, to Carol Drake, Jim Johnson, David Crane, and the staff at the Institute for being so gracious in keeping us all moving forward these last few days. My name is J.D. Steer, and I'm the Raise Hope for Congo campaign manager at the Enough Project. I'm speaking on behalf of Mark Quarterman, whom many of you know, who's now with the Enough Project. Unfortunately, Mark was unable to attend. He's deeply disappointed for not being able to make the dialogues. Mark is one of you. He's a lawyer with an international humanitarian law background, having served in several capacities in both the United States government and the United Nations. Mark is at home here. I am not. I might be the only non-lawyer at the mic throughout these dialogues. I came here by way of a university roommate who happened to be Dinka and one of the Lost Boys from South Sudan. For the better part of over a decade now, I've been traveling to that region and becoming increasingly engaged in the U.S. political system. I recently served a presidential appointment at the White House for President Obama, and then became a human rights activist with the Enough Project. And in that capacity, I stand here in awe of this group. I'm deeply honored to be here engaging with this community today. The Enough Project is a proud sponsor of the Humanitarian Law Dialogues and proud of our continued relationship with the Jackson Center and Chautauqua. The Enough Project is a project of the Center for American Progress and is aimed to end mass atrocities and crimes against humanity. Our primary areas of focus are the Great Lakes region of Africa, particularly Eastern Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, LRA-affected areas, and Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Enough has 30 staff in Washington, D.C., and a number of field staff, 2 in Goma, 2 in Juba, 1 in Kampala, and another in Nairobi that guide our work in the U.S. And the campaign's Conflict-Free Campus Initiative, which I'd be happy to discuss with any educators or students or interested folks throughout the day and night, has just passed 100 chapters in the United States. The Enough Project works primarily to influence U.S. government and, in some cases, private sector policy as it relates to human rights issues in our focus areas. We work to do this using both experienced policy analysis and grassroots movement building and education. You can see examples of our work, our reports and campaign materials at our table right outside in the lobby. In sum, we cover a range of socioeconomic, political, and security issues throughout our issue areas and are largely guided by 3 principles, which we call the 3 Ps. Protecting peace, providing protection, and punishment for perpetrators. To promote peace, we work to influence high-level diplomatic process aimed at creating peace and laying the groundwork for sustainable solutions. protection, we leverage our constituents to push for action that the U.S. and its partners must take to protect the country's citizens from crimes against humanity that the government cannot or will not. Finally, we advocate for punishment for perpetrators of war crimes and mass atrocities, both during and after atrocities, and advocate that these actors are brought to justice in a way that impact the communities, that positively impact the communities of their victims. While these guiding objectives take different shapes across their issue areas, one set of common principles runs constant: justice and accountability. It is the pursuit of these principles through our international criminal law that brings us each year to Chautauqua, and that is why I'm honored to introduce this morning's speaker. He's a distinguished research professor of law emeritus at DePaul University College and president emeritus of the Law School's International Human Rights Law Institute. He's also president of the International Institute for Higher Studies in Criminal Sciences at Syracuse, Italy, and honorary president of the International Association of Penal Law in Paris, France. He was instrumental in the creation of the International Criminal Court, for which he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. He's authored 32 books, over 240 published articles, and led the first modern criminal investigation in the Balkans. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this morning, very honored to introduce Mr. Cherif Bassiouni.
Thank you all for attending this early morning breakfast. It is either a tribute to the fact that you're early risers, or I consider that a personal tribute to me to have gone through the difficulty of awakening at such an early hour. Yesterday we were treated to a magnificent academic lecture by Leila Sadat, and I thought this format may not necessarily be the best thing for you to start the day with, and so allow me to sort of be a little more on a lighter note and a non-academic approach, even at the risk of appearing quite personal in the experiences I'm going to share with you. Now, the purpose of sharing these experiences and thoughts with you is not for purposes of either memorializing what I have seen in my 5 different commissions in 5 different war settings, but rather because I know that this will connect with so many of you who are working as prosecutors, investigators, judges, and for those of you who are doing research from the outside. So I will be somewhat eclectic, if I may. And I'm going to start with an observation, and I'm sure many of you who know the background of Nuremberg and Robert Jackson better than I do will probably have more to think about it than I do. Certainly John Derrick would. But I'm thinking of having read how the press reacted a year into Nuremberg. Sort of public attitude becoming rather bored. These proceedings are looking at pictures of Nuremberg, and I'm seeing, as you must have thought of, David, when you wind up in a place with 2, 3 other people and said, well, okay, you know, where do we start? How do we put the furniture together? You know, where's the screwdriver so that we can put the bench or the desk or whatnot together and get started? I imagine, you know, somebody arriving in Nuremberg all destroyed. How do I walk through the streets? Yes, I do find the only building that hasn't been bombed to go and work in, but that's basically about it. And I'm really dependent on the MPs to take me around to find me a place to sleep. And while the logistics of Nuremberg must have been relatively easy with respect to those working at it. You know, think of somebody like David in the middle of Sierra Leone, you know, having to start afresh and putting the furniture and the beds together and the desks and starting at that level. Again, it's an impressionistic approach. You want to think of a chief prosecutor as a general or a field marshal. But you know, my experience as a second lieutenant was probably the most meaningful in all of my 5 field missions because I had to do some of the things that you did in terms of facing all of the logistics and the practical things. Yesterday with Steve and Beth, we were talking about Libya, and I will recount the experience to show the point. I'm appointed chairman of the commission, and we need to go into the field. Well, the people in New York who are in charge of security, they have to decide that. Well, they're in New York, but they have to decide what's happening in Libya. And they said, well, you can't go to Libya. So I learned the tricks of the game. By the time I got to Libya, it was number 5 on my list, and so I knew how to get around it. And so I said, well, can I go to Cairo? And they said, oh, of course you can go to Cairo. So I went to Cairo. And from Cairo, I said, well, can I go to the border? And so they said, oh, sure, you can go to Saloon. So I went to Saloon. And I said, well, can I get into Libya? Well, you can't get into Libya. And of course, they need an excuse. You know, you have to think in those bureaucratic terms. And they said, well, you need certain armored-plated cars. You don't have armored-plated cars. And of course, there was a purpose why I did that. I called some people that I knew in the Egyptian military, and they had the military at the border cooperate with me, and every time I saw a UN car come by, we would stop the car. It was either a UNHCR or a UNICEF, and I would talk to the driver and the person, and I said, who's your boss? And they'd give me the name of the boss, and I'd call the boss in Cairo, and I said, well, can I have your car? And they would say, well, of course you can't have my car. Well, I said, well, relax. I have a car like it in Cairo. I will give it to you in trade. But I need this car because it has presumably armor plates in it that will save us. And so after a little bit of going back and forth, I was able to trade 5 cars. Well, I had a team of 25 people, so we decided we're going to do away with the driver, and one of our close security person was the driver. 5 of us got into a car, and we crossed into Libya. And so that required making contact with people into Libya, again, through my Egyptian friends. I called people in Benghazi, and they sent a couple of people with us to guide us through. The problem is we had not anticipated that during the months of March and April is the march of the strong easterly winds. And these winds are about 40, 50 miles an hour, and they blow a lot of sand in the desert. And so when you're going against 40, 50 mile an hour with a lot of sand, it's a bit difficult. So we did about 2,000 kilometers, 1,000 coming and 1,000 going, not knowing where to stop. So we stopped at whatever big building we thought was a hotel. Sometimes there was somebody in it, sometimes there wasn't. It was difficult to find food or water, but we
proceeded and kept doing our task. But it was full of improvisation, like many of you who have gone through some of these tribunals and some of these missions have had to improvise. I hope I'm not misquoting you, Hans, but I remember you once telling me that you flew to Kigali after the Security Council resolution on Rwanda, and you looked around and you said, well, we can't have a tribunal here. There's absolutely no logistical support or basis, and you felt that you had to ultimately go to Arusha because that was the only place where you could have the basic logistical support and facilities to be able to get started. So I'm sure that the same difficulties were not encountered in The Hague, nor would they be encountered in other major capitals, that things you would encounter in Sierra Leone and things that I have encountered in the former Yugoslavia. Logistics are the biggest hurdle, the biggest problem. And that is the one thing you'll never see written about. That's the one thing that when people are writing about the stories and glamorizing about the experiences, you know, you'll never realize that. Example that may interest those of you who were involved in the former Yugoslavia, Serge, we discovered, as you know, the Vukovar mass grave, that is the Security Council Commission of Experts. And so we decided with our forensic team to go to Vukovar. The place where the bodies were buried were in a cooperative farm, a little off the beaten path, and it was difficult to find, but we had some information and we went there. And we were in the middle of nowhere. A few kilometers away was a famous, infamous character by the name of Arkan, had his camp there. This was the place where he was doing all his smuggling trade in gasoline. And that was in 1993. And so we went there, we discovered the mass grave, we started taking the pictures, and then I went to headquarters, saw the commanding officer of the United Nations forces, and I said, we need to do a mass grave investigation. He said, well, where are you guys going to live? And I said, well, I don't know. I suppose we're going to find some tents. He said, where would you find the tents? Well, we started with looking for the tents, and we needed the staff. So I knew the then Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and as you all know, it's these personal contacts that save the day. So I went to see my colleague, Mr. Koymans, and I said, can you talk to the defense minister? The defense minister agreed to loan us 65 soldiers from a Dutch engineering battalion with all of their equipment, which included tents. Lo and behold, I realized that, you know, tents is not enough. You need portable toilets. And that was a big problem. So we got the tents, set up the tents, and so I went to the UN commanding officer, and he said, well, there's a Russian battalion next to you. Why don't you see if they'll help you out? And so I went to the Russian battalion. Guy offered me a glass of vodka, and he laughed, and he said, well, we have 2 portable toilets for 400 soldiers and officers. You're welcome to send your people to stand in line. But if you do a mass grave exhumation, which I hope you don't necessarily have to undergo that experience, you soon realize that in addition to the terrible experience of seeing bits and pieces of human bodies coming out, like a piece of a hand or a piece of a foot, and things that are quite disturbing. The point is that it usually smells a great The ground, especially if there's water, there's a lot of muck on the ground. And in addition to the psychological and the practical difficulties, it is something that requires something very simple, like a lot of hot water, so that the people who are working in the mass graves can go out occasionally and clean themselves up from all of the muck and, of course, all of the microbes and things that they will accumulate as they're going through it. And where do you get hot water in the middle of nowhere? So there was a Belgian battalion on the other side. I knew that I wasn't going to get away with anything with the Russians, so I went to the Belgian battalion, and he didn't have any hot water. He had occasionally some cold water that was brought to him by truck, but it was barely enough for his men, so no hot water for us. So we had to find our own transportation, get some water in, and how to heat the water. But then other things came about when we were getting all ready to move, and I had this beautiful contingent of 65 Dutch engineering battalions. Lo and behold, we realized that the Security Council had a ceiling on the number of UN forces, UNPROFOR forces that could be in the field. So we had to go and get a special Security Council resolution in order to authorize the addition of 65 additional men coming into. So now you have the logistics on one side, add all of these things, and now enter the politics, you know. And so you move from the logistics into the politics, and by the time you get into the politics, you go into, of course, a completely different world of intricacies. No less complicated on a relative basis, as a sort of an Einstein type of theory of relativity than the logistical problems you face. But the political problems have all sorts of different ways in which they go about it. You think that, well, maybe it's all about the geopolitical grand design of the political interest of states, and until you get into it and you realize, well, there's much more than that, and much more difficult to deal with, because you're dealing with personalities. Who is the ambassador that you're dealing with, and who is the foreign minister that you're dealing with, and how does this ambassador match with that ambassador? And you know, the two get along well. And so, I mean, if you're Sir Desmond and you go to the Foreign Office and you say, well, I'm going to have my Foreign Office people help out, and you go to, in my days in the former Yugoslavia, it was Sir David Hannay, who was in a constant tiff with Secretary General Boutros Ghali. And I was known to have been appointed and supported by Boutros Ghali. I was not persona grata in the company of Sir David. So there was no way of being able to get through that, but it had absolutely nothing to do with me. It happened to be that the person who had sponsored me was not getting along with him. So go figure out who it is that you want to go and knock at whose door and see how it's going to help. So you have different levels of those political aspects and political dimensions to take care of. And then you sort of find yourself in another situation that I would analogize to a shifting of gears. But bear in mind that you're constantly shifting gears. I mean, you're going from the logistics to the political, and now I'm going to go to my third gear, and that's the UN bureaucracy. And, you know, with all due respect to the many people who work assiduously at the United Nations to make it work, the system isn't good. And fortunately, you have a lot of very dedicated people who are making it work, but it's sort of like making it work against itself. I'll shift to another experience, Libya. When we first came, I was allowed to choose the staff that I wanted. And I wanted to choose the staff based on experience and on the fact that we needed people who spoke Arabic. We couldn't go into Libya with interpreters, a variety of reasons, one of which is that Gaddafi had banned the English language for 40 years. So there were very few people who spoke English. In my opinion, it just doesn't work when you go with an interpreter. You can't go to see people who are injured in hospitals, people whose relatives have been killed, or people who have been tortured, and go through an interpreter. There's an element of insensitivity that goes with it that you cannot subject the victim to again. You've got to be able to communicate the sense of empathy, and that is more important than anything else. I mean, the sense of human solidarity. And it's when I did what is really the world's first rape investigation in the former Yugoslavia, I and a team of 33 women interviewed 222 women victims. And I was the only man in the team. I thought that there shouldn't be other men, that they were all women. As I went through the sensitivity training with the women, each team was 3 women, 1 woman prosecutor with experience in violent crimes, 1 woman psychologist or psychiatrist, and 1 woman interpreter. And the first thing that I or anybody else would tell the woman victim is something to the effect that we've heard about you. We came here to express our concern and support and solidarity with you. And invariably, the 220 women would sort of fall into the arms of our 3 women investigators and go through a cathartic cry. And that was more important to me than anything else. Now, granted, the affidavits that we took and that wind up in the prosecutor's office may or may not have been as useful as some people think, but at least it was there. It may not be too much comfort for an estimated 20,000 women who have been raped in Bosnia. As I said, we obtained 575 affidavits of women who identified themselves. Most of them identified their perpetrators, with indications about 4,200 some cases. It may not be enough for them to have known that there was a case in Foča in which 3 persons were found guilty of rape. The record of history is never established in criminal proceedings. Criminal proceedings are very narrow. They're directed in a particular way. They are not a substitute for establishing the historic truth. They are not a substitute for bringing closure to the victims who have suffered. And we have to start thinking in terms of how do we balance these two, as well as other mechanisms together, such as victim compensation and other modalities of reaching out to the victims. But be that as it may, so you then get to the bureaucracy, and we had this excellent team, and we did really very good work, and because we had to go through 12 days in the desert together, it was really an adventure because we never knew where we were going to be the next day. And NATO was still bombing, and fortunately we communicated our positions almost by the minute to New York, which communicated to Brussels, and so we assumed that no stray plane was going to decide on shooting the convoy of 5 cars that was down there. So we came back and we were pretty satisfied with our work, only to discover through the Office of the High Commissioner that our team was going to be disbanded. Because the rules are that you can't have a team for more than 90 days. And so our team is gone. Well, now, how do we get another team? Well, we get another team by advertising the position. And you advertise the position, and people apply from within the system, and then you have to have a committee that decides who are the most meritorious and best people. And you, as chairman of the commission, have nothing to say about who is going to be on it or not. And so 3.5 months later, in which the Commission did almost absolutely nothing except whatever we could do, we now have a new team. Well, of course, the new team has to be trained and indoctrinated, and anybody who has done investigations will know that it's not easy to train a team of investigators together and to brief them on the background and the conditions and the people and what the quirks of the people are. And, you know, I mean, if you go to the Zintan mountain areas, you know, the people there have a completely different attitudes, and please don't tell them that you like the people from Benghazi or from Tripoli. That would be as much as going in Gaza and tell them you have great friends in Tel Aviv. Things like that, you know, you can't learn in the books. It's the sensitivity you acquire from being part of the ethos and pathos of what's going on. But after 3.5 months, we had a new team, and we try to make the team work together as best we can. And then we ran into a bureaucratic quirk that none of us would have thought about. As we decided on our first field missions, we planned on having 12 of our 19 staff go with us. And we were informed by the Office of Security we could only have 6. And I said, you know, why would we only have 6? I mean, you know, we're an independent commission. Why can't we take the people we want or the people we think we need? Well, after a lot of digging, it turned out that there was an emergency evacuation plan that contemplated evacuating X number of people. I think it was 256. And you couldn't have more than 256 UN-affiliated persons in country, because that was the seats available on a plane that was chartered sitting in Malta that could have flown in to remove the people from there. So other agencies had already sent people in, and they were on the ground, so there was only 6 people left. So for the rest of the duration of our mission, for 6 months, we had to rotate our investigators to go in and out for durations of 10 days to 2 weeks, 6 at a time. Imagine what this means in terms of the continuity of the work, in terms of the synergies of the work that needs to be done. It was a total disruption of the work and made very difficult the ability to put things together. And by the time you needed to put things together, you couldn't go back to the field to check something out. And I'll give you a small example. We discovered a certain number of locations that were bombed by NATO. They were very weird locations. They were all in civilian areas, totally out of the beaten path, had nothing to do with any military target or political target. So you scratch your head and you say, why would they bomb here? And you know, we're speaking of these extraordinary bombs, the 2,000-pound bombs that are extremely accurate. We would go to places where I mean, if this part of the room was to be bombed, this part of the room was bombed, this table was untouched. I mean, it's just extraordinary how accurate these bombs are. So why do we find these places bombed? And, you know, we discovered over 20 such targets and over 100 persons killed as a result of these, and the families coming up to us and talking to us. And so I thought to myself in logical terms, well, could it be pilot's error? But there were thousands of sorties. There were never any pilot's errors. I talked to a few of the pilots, and they said, no, it's impossible. All right, so it's not pilot's error. Maybe it's intelligence error. Maybe somebody gave intelligence that was faulty, that says, you know, Gaddafi came and spent the night here. Again, I thought back of my experience in Iraq, and, you know, Saddam was moving from house to house, and I said, well, maybe after all, you know, he or somebody important was there. Well, this was so out of beaten path, nobody had ever dreamt of it. So apparently that was to be discarded. So what was it? Well, the only thing left was faulty something. Yes, maybe there was something faulty in the guidance mechanism of the projectile. You know, now you're back hot smack into the politics of things. Who are you going to lay this story on? I mean, for me, it would have been very easy. I would have blamed Stephen Rapp, and that was it, you know. But it wasn't as simple as that. Steve, how come did you send these faulty bombs to NATO? You have to deal with all of these dimensions. But the bureaucracy, unlike the politics, does not only have the high-level personalities and the personality clashes you can have between a Boutros Ghali and a David Haney. It's all, if you'll forgive me, small and petty stuff. And that is absolutely the worst. You get into the quagmire of the small and petty stuff of bureaucracy and the fight between different agencies wanting to have credit for this or a greater recognition for that, or, is this the future unit that will be doing more of that work? Because, that means more personnel, and more personnel means you get promoted as a chief. If you're a P4 in that section and you get 10 more people, you're a P5, and that's, maybe your hope before your career ends to be a D1. So there are all sorts of things that are pertaining to it. And once you get in that quicksand is the best word I can think of, unless you have a lot of friends throughout the bureaucracy, you're never going to extricate yourself. As a system, the system will not work. You can only navigate, these troubled waters, to use another metaphor, by the connections you have, by the friends you have, by those who will be able to produce the results you're. Again, mind you well, you'll never see that in books and law review articles. You'll never see that in people recalling how things were at a given time, and especially when you start now adding all of these dimensions together. Well, I've come to a conclusion, and it may be due to my age, so I will apologize for what may seem to you to be a sign of pessimism. For many years, I continued to refer to it as a sense of realism, and maybe now I'm getting to the point where I must confess a little bit of pessimism. I cannot rationally understand why is it that every time you have a commission of inquiry, and the Human Rights Council has established 30 of them, every time you have a special procedures, and there are about 40 of them going on, every time you have a special tribunal or whatnot, why is it that we all have to start from zero? Why is it that we all have to start from scratch? I mean, there are simple things, and I'll speak of commissions of inquiries. In commissions of inquiries, why is it that we don't have a simple database program that every commission can use to input the data or information that they have, so that you can at least compare the data, so that you don't have to wrestle with developing a database system on your way into the job? Doesn't make sense. Why don't you have translated in a real manual? I mean, those of us who have been in the military see that manuals do work, of what we call best practices. I've never seen best practices translated into a manual, so that if you're a new chairman appointed to a commission, here's the manual. Step 1, you do this. Step 2, you do this. Step 3, you do this. And let's move on. And we're not reinventing the wheel. Doesn't happen. You're reinventing the wheel on the logistics, on the resources, on the personnel, on almost everything. And it continues like that. Well, at one point you can say, well, it's the nature of the beast. But I think you get to the point where you say, well, is there any method to this madness? Is that intentional? I mean, is the sense of realpolitik so overpowering that there is a type of inertial force that brings about these obstacles and prevents moving forward? And I think there might be. I think there might be for one simple reason, is because the notion of realpolitik and political interest varies depending upon each conflict and is sort of unexpected. Had anyone really expected Russia's reaction with respect to Syria the way it manifested itself? Probably not. I mean, I would have assumed that, Russia's primary interest are the two naval bases they have on the Mediterranean and in Syria. That Secretary Clinton would have called up Lavrov and said, hey, whatever comes out of Syria, don't worry, you can keep your two bases and, neutralize the Russians. I don't know. Maybe that's the obstacle. Maybe it isn't. The idea that, oh no, Syria is a good customer of Russia and buys the weapon. Yes, but they don't pay. So I don't know how good a customer it is. So it's a little questionable here. So, but you don't know what the dynamics are. I mean, think a little bit when I first came into play with the Yugoslavia Commission. This was the Security Council resolution was adopted in October of 1992. Now, between October of 1992 and 1947, what happened? Well, really nothing. We went through the Cold War. International justice was at a halt. It was at a stop. Sure, there were efforts. I mean, the United Nations valiantly continued to push forth the idea of establishing a draft code against the peace and security of humankind. There was a committee that produced in 1951 a draft statute for an international criminal court, but because the code was not ready, it had to be passed on. Here, allow me a little parenthesis. Look at the timing of things. 1946, First General Assembly resolution embodying the Nuremberg Principles. 1947, establishment of the Commission for the Draft Code. 1950, establishment of the Committee for the Court. So first effort here, separate the code from the court. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Also, does it make sense that the committee working on the code is in Geneva and the committee working on the court is in New York? No, it doesn't make sense. Does it make sense that one meets in the summer and the other one meets in the winter? Of course not. What's the purpose of that? Delay. So finally, when the committee in New York decided on a first draft of the code of the court, it was 1951. But by then the code wasn't ready. So they decided to go back to the drawing board. So they produced the next text, which is in 1953. 1953, the draft code is still not ready. So the 1953 code to establish the International Criminal Court has to be tabled because the code isn't ready. So you see, there is some method to that madness. So it's tabled. So now we wait. 1954, we have the draft code that comes out. But wait. 1952, the General Assembly, in its infinite wisdom, withdrew from the committee doing the code the inclusion of aggression and gave it to another committee. Well, that was a governmental committee, so as to avoid the possibility that the experts committee might go faster. So now we have the governmental committee works from 1952 to 1974 on defining aggression. In the meantime, the draft code of offenses is completed in 54, submitted to the General Assembly. Well, what is the General Assembly going to do with it since we don't have aggression? Well, you got to table it too. So we tabled the court in 53 because the code wasn't there. We tabled the code in 54 because aggression wasn't there. And when aggression came about in 1974, it took 4 years of a political battle to re-put the item again on the agenda in 1978. And then the whole thing got transferred back to the ILC. So now the ILC gets it, and then you have another bureaucratic device that comes into play. Now, it's very simple. If you want something done, you give it to somebody who can do it, right? If you don't want something done, you give it to somebody who can't do it. Well, So the ILC had a very distinguished Senegalese judge. Actually, he was Minister of Foreign Affairs by the name of Doudou Thiam. Doudou had, I think, stopped reading anything by the 50s, and it also had to be French. If it wasn't French, it wasn't worth reading. English was sort of on his blacklist, and so he was given the task of putting together the draft code. So, Doudou went along, and by 78, by 1991, he produced a text, and he produced a text consisting of 26 articles in which he wrote really what he felt should be included, things that we may all agree with, that colonialism is an international crime, that anything that deeply affects the environment is an international crime. And of course you look at it and you say, well, these are very laudable objectives and goals, but what about the principles of legality? This is not the way you define a crime. But there was a little bit of badness in that. And so, anyway, to date, there is no such thing as the draft code of offenses against the peace and security of humankind. A laudable effort that started in 1947. They finally produced a text in 1996, went to the General Assembly. It is still pending before the General Assembly, though the 26 crimes were now reduced to 5 crimes, 3 of which are defined in the ICC statute, nevertheless never saw the light of day. So again, you can see how bureaucracy, how prolonging things, how sending things from committee to committee manages to eviscerate the substance out of certain initiatives. In the meantime, other things are going on to keep us occupied, to keep us busy, to answer public opinion. And, I sort of am reminded a little bit of what must have happened about 1919. You have to sort of project yourself, if you can, in the aftermath of World War I and the terrible destruction that took place. The 20 million people killed in an absolutely senseless, stupid war of the trench warfare that we look upon, and people coming out of a trench and attacking and being killed and mowed down. I mean, you read some of the press of the time, and truly, the youth of the time in Europe was totally decimated by this stupid warfare. And a lot of very strange things happened. But, the one thing that was very important, especially to the French and to the Belgians, was the responsibility of the Kaiser, the responsibility of the head of states. The great success of convicting a Taylor or an Akiyatsu or other heads of states, really has its genesis in going after Kaiser Wilhelm II. And everybody, as I said, in France and in Belgium were really absolutely intent on the prosecution. Well, the UK, which manages sometimes to develop the finest drafts persons in the world, sent somebody from Whitehall to Versailles to draft what is Article 227. And I really urge you to read it. It's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece because it defines what we now call the crime of aggression as the supreme crime against the sanctity of treaties. Now, anyone who has done first-year criminal law knows that the supreme offense against the sanctity of treaties does not satisfy the principles of legality, that you really can't establish what the elements of that crime are. But you know what? On the front pages of newspapers, it really had a positive effect. Every newspaper of the time had this in. The Kaiser is charged with the supreme offense against the sanctity of treaties. And lo and behold, the Kaiser finds refuge with his good relatives in a nice castle in the Netherlands. And there's a story that I think Claude Mullins finds out in a book he wrote at the time, where a lieutenant colonel from Texas, who believes the things he reads in the papers, thought that really the Kaiser was wanted by the world community, and how is it possible that he could have gone and sought refuge in this castle. So he gathers 11 of his men on two Ford cars and drives the 40 kilometers and sees the Kaiser, who, by the way, was a short fellow. And when you wear this long gray coat of the German army at the time and you're at a distance, you appear even shorter. And he was sort of flabbergasted to see that this was the Kaiser was called the ogre at the time of the world, that to see this ogre of the world coming up, and being from Texas, he didn't quite know how to address him, so he said, "Are you Mr. Kaiser?" Yes, and to his absolute discomfiture, he saw a brigadier wearing a British uniform running out of the castle, and he said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I'm the liaison officer with the Kaiser here." And so he discovered that the Kaiser was not only in the Netherlands by the grace of the Dutch government, but also with the great understanding of the British government. Well, you know, people should have read a little bit of genealogy. I mean, the Kaiser was the grandson of Queen Victoria. You know, just as you know, the Tsar of Russia was the grandson of Queen Victoria, and they were cousins. And there's no way that the monarchy in England was going to allow the grandson of Queen Victoria to be put on trial. Why, the next thing you will have is a Queen or King of England is going to be put on trial, and that would be totally unacceptable. And so, as a result of that, the Kaiser found refuge in the Netherlands, and you can see from the papers in the Dutch Foreign Office when a delegation came, and the Dutch, of course, took the blame for it, as they did in Srebrenica. But the Dutch says, well, what is the crime? And if we want to extradite him, we need double criminality, and we really don't have a crime in the Netherlands that says the supreme offense against the sanctity of treaties. So, ergo, the Kaiser stayed there. This beautiful provision remained in Article 227, and off we go. In the meantime, the UN, the War Crimes Commission, the commission established responsibility, names over 20,000 persons to be prosecuted. I don't know, how many did you possibly have in Sierra Leone when you first started? 70,000, 80,000 people you could have indicted? But you know, certainly in Rwanda there was a large number of people. You know, how do you go about doing that? You suddenly realize, well, you can't. You know, that's why the formula is the most significant of them, or the highest, or whatever it is, and then you have to make that choice. But that choice you can make when you have a sort of a category B, like you know, in Tokyo with the Yokohama trials for the category B. But if you don't have a category B that you can prosecute elsewhere, it's not going to be very, very good to just have a small sliver of people. And so you look at the possibility of who are you going to include and who are you going to exclude, and suddenly you realize again that you've got a very difficult task ahead of you. I know that my time has come and that you have other things to do for the rest of the day, but I'm going to summarize by saying this. It may be something very, very simple and very obvious, but what you see is not what's necessarily there. And for those of you who are doing research, historical or otherwise, you have to dig a little deeper, and you have to understand the practicalities of things. And you have to make allowance for the political circumstances, the political environment. I'll go back to 1992 when the Commission of Experts was established. This was a period of time in which there was a hiatus with the Cold War that went back to 1947. Was the international community ready to shift gears at the time? I suspect not. Was the international community willing to make a choice between the pursuit of a political settlement, which is sometimes erroneously called the pursuit of peace? It's not peace, it's a political settlement, or justice, however relative it may be. At the time, David Owen and then Cyrus Vance were negotiating. And so, where did, again, forgive me for personalizing, where did I stand? Where did the Commission stand in relationship to what they were doing? What was more important? Of course, politically, their work was more important. So the Commission had to be kept in check. And there was somebody who made sure the Commission was kept in check. And it wasn't going to be in an obvious way. It was going to be in a bureaucratic way. Well, we don't have offices for you. Well, you've got to be in New York first, then you've got to go to Geneva. Then you have 2 offices in Geneva, and then we don't have a staff, then we don't have a budget, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, realpolitik does not take the same form that it took historically of saying no to justice. It's a question, how do you co-opt justice? How do you instrumentalize bureaucracies and other techniques and mechanisms in order to slow it down or prevent it from reaching its result, or making it difficult for it to reach results that impair the realpolitik goals and objectives of the international community. And so in that situation, frankly, it was very difficult. And the fact that we were able to ultimately produce a report of 3,500 pages, find the resources to publish it, attach 72,000 documents to it, over 300 hours of videotapes, 3,000 pictures, and my reaching out with a lot of difficulty first to Ramon Escobar and then to Richard Goldstone to train his staff, give him the material and getting them started. I don't think what one author wrote in a book called The Cascade of Justice would have really happened. I mean, at the risk of sounding very self-congratulating, that's not the purpose. What I'm trying to say is that this sort of broke the barrier, and then the Cascade of Justice followed. Now, the importance of the Cascade of Justice is the cascade effect is powerful, and it brings something in. But my fear is that the Cascade of Justice has come to an end. That with ICTY and ICTR and all of the mixed model tribunals disappearing, we're left with the ICC. And we're left with an ICC that has a slim record. Now, we can spend a lot of time blaming people for why the record is slim or what the difficulties are. That's not the point. The point is, what is it that we can do to shore up that record in the future? And Hans Corell was absolutely correct that probably the most important conceptual accomplishment that was done at the General Assembly's Preparatory Committee for the ICC and then in Rome was the adoption of complementarity. That is the most important concept for the future of international criminal justice. The future of international criminal justice may no longer be in the direction of international tribunals that are going to substitute for or replace national institutions. It's going to be for national institutions assuming their own responsibilities. It's going to be for national institutions to use their jurisdictional mechanisms in order to be able to reach for those people who are able to get off the impunity net. And the international institutions are going to be there for the absolutely exceptional cases. But the problem that we have, if you think about it, is a problem of timing. As we get to the end of 2013 and the two major ad hoc tribunals close, and you know, the other tribunals close, I mean, think for a minute, and I hate to use this term, but you know, who now remembers the tribunal in East Timor or in Kosovo? You know, they're gone. They're away from the memory. Tomorrow, will we still remember Sierra Leone? And so, as these ad hocs and these mixed model tribunals disappear, and we're back with the ICC with a limited number of cases, high level of personnel, extraordinarily expensive budget, failure to go into the field to investigate, responsiveness only to one area and one region of the world and not to others, you know, where does that leave us? Is there going to be a sense of disillusionment? How can those of us who are in that area make sure that we can cushion that sense of disillusionment when it happens? How can we avoid, how can we fill the void that will appear at the time? And how can we hasten the process of complementarity by enhancing national legislation? It certainly is not, as the Coalition for the International Criminal Court or Amnesty does, by touting that there are over 100 countries in the world that have passed laws against crimes against humanity. That is wrong. One does not manipulate data like that to create wrong impressions. The fact that a given government has acceded to the ICC statute and passed some general legislation doesn't mean that they've amended their criminal code or their military code and so on and so forth. There's a lot that needs to be